EPA Chief Scott Pruitt tangled up in yet another scandal, if you can believe it. According to the Washington Post, Pruitt had a top aide reach out to Republican donors to see if they might have a job for his wife. Well, she eventually got a position with a conservative political group that supported Pruitt. Let's talk about it with one of the reporters who broke this story, the Washington Post, Josh Dawsey. Yet another one. Walk us through this one.
So Scott Pruitt had one of his top EPA aides, along with a donor, work for several months to try and find his wife a paid position in Washington. Eventually, she was given a job at the Conservative Judicial Crisis Network, which is a right-wing group that pushes for conservative judges and really excoriates judges they don't deem conservative enough. But what's interesting to us about the story is that, he relied on people who have business in front of the agency and a senior EPA aide for this extensive search to make sure his wife was getting a paycheck every month.
You also report that there was one of these people who they went to approach to hire her, one of these donors,
Right.
said he couldn't hire her because of a conflict of interest. That's the right answer. But then what did the Pruitt team do?
Right. So that part of the story essentially derived from him reaching out to Doug Deason, who's a Texas donor who has oil and gas interest. Essentially, when they asked Mr. Deason to consider hiring Marlon Pruitt, Scott Pruitt's wife, Mr. Deason said that he could not because he has business in front of the EPA. It was a bit interesting to us that the donor was the one who disclosed the conflicts and that those were not realized by the EPA immediately. But then Mr. Deason spent several months brainstorming other potential jobs for Marlon Pruitt, Scott Pruitt's wife. He was ultimately unsuccessful. So the Pruitts eventually relied on Leonard Leo, who is kind of a conservative kingmaker in town, runs Supreme Court process for the administration, helps pick a lot of judges to get this other paid job.
Also helped on that trip to Italy, the $100,000 trip to Italy, right? That Pruitt took that raised so many questions. What's the EPA saying about this? What's Pruitt saying?
The EPA is saying they're referring this to their outside lawyers and they're not commenting at all.
Okay.
But it's, the repeated stories of his effort to get her a Chick-fil-A franchise using an EPA employee that we reported last week. Efforts to basically for months and months to find work for his wife because Scott Pruitt was telling his aides that he needed more money and could not live in Washington on the salary of being an administrator alone.
But the president, continues at least publicly to voice his support of Scott Pruitt because he's executing the president's wishes inside of the EPA, right? Rolling back a lot of these regulations. The president just last week said, and I quote, "People are really impressed with the job that's being done at the EPA. Thank you very, very much, Scott," meaning Scott Pruitt. But yet, even Republican Senator Joni Ernst said this is as swampy gets. So for the sort of anti-drain the swamp president, why is he willing to stick with Pruitt?
The president really liked Scott Pruitt, as you said, and Scott Pruitt has conducted a lot of his deregulatory agenda. A lot of high-profile Trump donors and supporters, like Harold Hamm, really like Scott Pruitt, and he hears consistently from conservatives around the country that Scott Pruitt's one of the most effective members of his cabinet. What's interesting to us is that support for Pruitt inside the West Wing has eroded. Basically, the president is the only person left in the building who supports Scott Pruitt, but the president really supports Scott Pruitt. He also has talked to Scott Pruitt about his frustrations with Jeff Sessions, as the New York Times first reported this weekend. That's certainly true, and he has talked to Scott Pruitt about a number of political issues outside of the EPA. He's one of the president's favorite cabinet members, and so far the drip of ethical issues has not changed that dynamic for the president.
Important reporting, as always. Josh Dawsey, nice to have you. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.